In this tutorial, we'll essentially go over how I go from importing Modern Warfare models and animations, then swap out the gun models for something more funky. This technique is how I've made these what I like to call FPS edit, but regardless, I'll show from start to finish with the proper workflow of importing Call of Duty's proprietary seanims, exams based on armature systems in Blender with multiple ways I'll be explaining, then how to properly set up your armature and optionally add more attachments, the whole material spiel, NLA sequencing, animation layers, and all that jazz. So first of all, it's the conception of what animations are you importing from. Ideally, you're looking towards the new Modern Warfare animation. As such, you'll need to import the C models and CMs respectively that have their own workflow, compared to X model and XMs, which is an exported format utilized for World at War and Black Ops 3 modding. The other big thing is to consider that the games made by Infinity Ward and Treyarch have their own slight but important differences in the armature rig they use in-game, and as such, animations from Black Ops Cold War won't work on Modern Warfare 2019's character 100% of the time without some issue. Because of this, if you're looking towards the most streamlined way of not having to fight between these systems, I'd highly recommend utilizing the Skylord's Black Ops 3 collection that has done an amazing job of porting all weapons from COD 4 all the way up to Vanguard to work with Black Ops 3's armature system. This way, all you need is a set of Black Ops 3 view model arms, then you can import the X model gun of choice alongside XAMs with no issues. I'll link a separate guide on this so you can follow the steps, and then come back here when you're ready with the rig setup. A few disclaimers. One thing I'm going to do that's annoying, I'm going to be calling the guns by their real names. So if you don't know what a SCAR L is, then I implore you to IMFDB, or you just know from heart because you get good. More annoyingly, I work mostly with the outliner and other windows like the NLA and material editors on the second monitor. So I'll drag into view when needed and just pause on what I'm doing from that window. I want to implore the fact that there will also be plenty of techniques shown here for view model animations that aren't standard practice at all, and it's purely for concept and rendering videos instead of something that's actually going to be used as in-game animation. So don't take this as, say, a tutorial for properly porting custom guns with Modern Warfare 2 animations for a Fallout 4 mod. You can take some steps, but not all. And finally, I'll be providing all dot blends shown in this tutorial so you can follow through and dissect any parts you're confused with. Now back to the C model and CM thing. This workflow is obviously here in the first place because we like to import animation straight from the game ourselves or from a certain mega collection, link in the description, given that Sky has yet to port the Modern Warfare 2 and Modern Warfare 3 animations for Black Ops 3. We'll have to deal with CMs ourselves, or if there's any animation that won't be in Sky's collection. So first of all, you can't just import C models and CMs individually like this, or also offset. Maybe you can fix it as such, but I haven't been able to do so. So let's go into the method of using C model merger. That's a mouthful. Before we merge our models, you can make sure you have all components of the gun by making sure you have the bare minimal parts like the receiver, pistol grip, magazine, barrel, and stock, at least for an assault rifle. You can see from the suffix like bare long instead of barrel indicates the long version of the barrel, and stock heavy instead of stock tack as another example. But we can add these later since they're static attachments, as I'll show later. Also, make sure it's VM, which stands for view model, and not WM, which is the world model. That's just a slightly lower poly version. You can still use WM C models technically, but I mean, we want the highest poly obviously. If there's any doubt, you can double check by importing each C model in Blender to make sure it's all the parts you want. Most importantly, making sure you at least merge the receiver magazine with the view model arms at bare minimum. Use C model merger to merge all attachments, including magazine, with the view model by just clicking and dragging into the .exe, and we got our merged C model. Then import into Blender with the C model add-on, link in the description for that. Now I was in cahoots with the people on Discord server when working with these, and some have reported that when importing alongside with the magazine attached when using the model merger, it would go haywire. So there is a case where that could happen, and to fix that, he was simply just, instead of merging everything including the magazine, you would just not choose to merge with the magazine And then we got a separate merged C model, and then I'm just going to make sure that this is the version with no magazine, and we can see that in Blender, yep, there's no magazine. And then we would import the magazine C model individually, and then put it in the collection, and then put a child of constraint, and then target that to the armature bone as tag match attach. And then when you import animations, you would have to import the CN both for the complete full model merge without the magazine, and then again for the magazine, the same CN. And then in the NLA editor, you would have to sync this up. And you can see it's working just as before. This is just in case if the magazine is going haywire, if you merged both all the gun parts and the magazine. And this is just a method in case of emergency. Now, first thing you want to do is make sure the project settings is set to 30 FPS. I'm just going to categorize the collections with the gun model only, since we'll be hiding that later on when we replace the gun model. And if you want to make the bones smaller, since they're a bit too big, what you can do is make the selection as individual origins and axes as local, and then scale down in edit mode of the armature, and then when we scale it down and make it easier to work with, and it's not messing up the armature at all. By the way, funny thing, these view model arms are actually from Modern Warfare 2019, and they work regardless because, well, I mean, are you surprised? Yeah, they would be bothering changing the armature bones between Modern Warfare 2 and Modern Warfare 2019. But yeah, you can obviously use Modern Warfare 2 view model arms too. I just like these because, and here I'm adding my FPS camera setup that I got set to with an FOV of 83.2, and I'll talk about that. Now what I'm just doing is going to constraints, copy rotation, and adding that constraint to the tag camera bone, making sure the mix is add, which I already got. And then I'm adding a video reference as the background image for the camera, and making sure that video footage that we got is 30 FPS. Now about that FOV thing, about why it's 83.2 exactly. Now if you know anything about Modern for Call of Duty, is that they have a separate view model layer with that set around 83.2 from guesstimating overlaying game footage with Blender and using the same exact gun model and positioning it as such. And then with that, the world FOV can actually scale with your in-game FOV, so it doesn't distort your view model like how in older Call of Duty, when you crank the FOV scale, both the view model and world distort in such a manner. Some might like that look, it just looks weird, so I like to keep it 80.2. But there is a method to just simply have both the view model rendered differently and then the world later. I'm just adding boxes of your liking, I don't know, maybe have pictures of hot dogs. And then I'm making collections for the sites that are down in a different collection, and then just hiding that, putting it in there. This is if you want to have an optic later on. Now let's say you want to add a barrel or a stock afterwards, since, I don't know, we want something longer and heavier. And with that, all we can just do is just import the long barrel separately, just a C model. We don't have to like merge or anything like that again. And then all we just do is once we import it, we add a child of constraint, and then we add the target as the armature, and then choose the bone that's respective to that attachment. So for in this case, for a barrel, it will be tag barrel attach, and then that's vice versa for stock, for example, tag stock attach and all that stuff. You can see how this applies for every other attachment. So for example, let's say we want to add an optic, and then all we just do is again child of constraint, and we have multiple choices. We have tag scope, tag holo. I found tag holo to be the correct one based on guesstimating where the red dot should be. Alright, let's quickly import a CM to see all this in action. Just gonna import VM E05 AR Charlie Impact CM, and it's all good. It's all working, everything's attached, nothing floating weirdly. Alright, materials time. This one's gonna be a little doozer. So the COD shaders you've seen across multiple videos are slight different interpretations of how to utilize the CS/notch textures, as CS stands for color and specular, notch stands for normal, occlusion, and glossiness, that Infinity Ward engines uses with changes in the math nodes that can look different at times based on the material. Textures and preferences like if the material is metallic or not, is it semi-translucent and whatnot. The best I've seen so far is by @BigMikeMW, but it seems he hasn't disclosed his shader setup. So we got two choices, and I'll show the best one, but with the caveat that you need to convert all materials manually. So what you do is select the material of choice in your object. I like to go to edit mode, select say like this selection, making sure that we are targeting what material we want to choose, seeing this X material 1706 blah blah blah, and then I like to double confirm what textures I'm converting with Image Glass, which is a lightweight free image viewer that I really like to use. And what we're seeing here is, from the looks of it, is the color and specular image. So what we have to do is set the mode to COD, specular, and albedo, Infinite Warfare and Modern Warfare, and then just drag that .dds into it. And then for the texture that looks like a normal map, that's the notch map. And then again, we have to choose the mode to COD, normal, gloss, occlusion, Infinite Warfare, Modern Warfare, and then drag that in, and then it'll convert as such. The reason we have to do this instead of mode automatic is because the naming convention is missing from the suffix, and you can't do that to make sure that the game image util could pick that up, but you could also just do it this way of just manually choosing the mode here and there. Now the last one, that this colorful like green one, is the CM mask, which is optional, but sometimes it is useful. So in this case, all you just do is set the mode to automatic, so we convert this to a PNG. Since DDS is quite tricky in Blender and could probably not look as proficient as PNG. While at it, I'm also just going to delete the unnecessary images, such as these small itsy bitty whatever is going on, and then this blurry one, that's the thermal map. We won't be needing those. The topmost texture node is for _C base color, and then the one below is for _S specular. Now you'd be wondering why you wouldn't plug the _S into specular in the Principal B SDF. Well, from my discovery with dealing with materials for a couple of guns, I found that there's bits from _S that would be a combined of _C for the actual base color. Like for example, if you can tell, you can just directly plug in ._SC. Those metallic highlights from _S are missing and it's just blacked out. So I used this color ramp node attached to _C to mask out the blacked out parts for _S bits. And with both, it looks more in line with the complete base color texture. I've seen varying levels of how much the _cold texture is missing out color bit. So yeah, hence why I'm doing such. A few times I fiddle with the color ramp based on what looks correct. Like here you can tell if I'm cranking this white level to a certain point, it starts eroding away the _C texture. So I found this value best, and I just set this as a base standard. Also, here's where the CM mask goes. Now there's one more shenanigan bit that I'm doing as a custom thing, and that's the metallic map. So if you notice, there's no definitive metallic map that from the CM models textures are found. So what I'm doing here is using, in this case, the green value with using a separate color node as the metallic, and it seems in line with the metallic parts. But other times, if say the CM mask is missing, I like to use a color ramp node that's attached from either the base color or the _S texture, and that gives the information of what bits are metallic. And then I just go about adjusting these to my liking and seeing based on like in-game screenshots of what looks correct. And this can be in a case-by-case basis, especially if there's no CM mask to begin with, which some materials can be like that. And with all of that, just as simple as changing this, the glossiness texture map, and this one for normal map, and then making sure both are set to non-color space. Now, as a point of comparison, doing all this hassle converting the CS notch materials to PBR with the game image util versus just plugging in the CS and notch directly to this COD shader by Killshot, and you can see it isn't as proficient obviously in choosing how you want to make it look. And on top of that, overall it could vary depending on what materials you're setting up. Is sometimes the COD shader could look better, and then other times just choosing the PBR method is better. And obviously because it's way more, adaptable to other game engines. Say if you want to bring it to Unreal Engine, maybe there's not a shader for that. So converting to PBR is your only method, especially if you're exporting for another game. And even though I usually just, for the most part, just do the hassle of converting all the CS knowledge with textures to PBR, there are points where I admit defeat and just use the COD shader, and that's if there's like these small parts, the iron sights, that's not really like having many details and different points of metallic and roughness, and it's just too minute to care about, so I just use the COD shader. Now I have the iron sights back up and remove the red dot for a reason I'll get into later. Since I'll be changing the model for the Nerf SCAR anyways, I won't be needing it. Now finding the seanims from the full archive is easier thanks to the weapon codename being given to us when we extracted the contents of the gun. So let's search for the SCharlie CM, and you don't need .cast or one that doesn't have an extension at all, it's just a file. And .cast is a new format that may be replacing CMs, I don't know. But let's just get into those CMs and put it in a convenient folder for our collective SCAR animations. Now let's just import our CM of choice. First I'm going to do vm.po5 editor as Charlie, raise first, and then once we got that in the NLA editor, we just click this button to drop it down in NLA timeline, and then we would just drag that in, and then using the reference footage to line it up and sync it. And as a tip, animation starts when the crosshair disappear. And then we're just doing this for all the other CMs, and this is the order of which the animations we got going on. And we got that complete. Now what about the firing animation? And when I search for it, there actually isn't seem to be. Switch off is for switching between semi-auto and auto, and the reason for this is because it's done in-game using a combination of recoil and kick values with additive animations. So you can either choose to, well, simulate that, which would be a lot of work, and whatever measures you're gonna do, but I will be 3D tracking it. That I'll show once we got all the NLA animations sorted. Now for the juicy part, changing the gun model. And for this demonstration, I'm going to replace the gun model with something that has similar proportions to a SCAR, and that being another SCAR. This one from Battlefield 2042, and before moving into a wacko version of the Nerf SCAR L, because, well, you'll be seeing very soon why we move first onto this model. Before importing our gun model, I usually like to parent all the parts and meshes to a null, centered around the trigger guard, since that's pretty much the universal center point for every gun. So just append the model, then scale and position as closely to the neutral pose of the model for 2 SCAR L. Just double check in the NLA editor that you aren't mid animation or anything, and you're staying in an idle frame for the next steps. You can see why adding the null around the trigger guard helps with this. Just some tips when moving into place. Definitely prioritize the mag well, and then for the elevations of the rails being aligned, and finally with the finger just touching the trigger. Ideally, this is how I position the gun between these 3 points of contact. Also, don't rotate the gun even if the target weapon is tilted. When we parent it, it'll tilt and rotate for us. Now that's aligned to my best ability. Time for the centerpiece of all of this. I'm going to select the J gun bone from the Model for 2 SCAR and then cursor to selected. Make sure the scale of these nulls are 1.0 by the way, and then parent the null for the Battlefield 2042 SCAR under J gun and add a copy transform constraint set to the J gun bone. And already it's apparent that the gun is now following the animation of Model for 2 SCAR 1-to-1. So how about the other parts, obviously the most important being the magazine? Well, it's the same workflow. Instead, we select the J mag 1 bone in this case, making sure a null and parenting the magazine to null. And again, once we're done seeing the J gun bone is all good and working in action, we go back to an auto frame. And then we'll also do one for J mag 2 so you can get those tactical reloads going on. So here I'm just selecting the J mag 1 bone that's under tag mag attach, and then cursor to selected again, adding a null. I'm conveniently naming this as J mag 1 just to remind myself, and then attaching the first magazine mesh into that, and then adding a copy constraint. And once we've got it parented, we can freely move the magazine mesh itself to adjust accordingly. Say where the magazine was clipping a bit into the mag well, I just made it thinner so it can fit in. Of course you can't move JMag null 1 null since that's how it's constrained. Now for JMag 2, the best method I got to correctly place it is to go towards the end of a reload animation, hide the second magazine's mesh because we want to just go to the frame before JMag 1 appears. So here you can see no magazine because that's where JMag 2 will appear. Then after that, it'll swap with JMag 1. We're doing this since in idle, JMag 2 is off screen like so. And it's better to make sure that the magazine matches up by using a point where it's seated in the mag as well and not somewhere else animated about. So once we got our target frame, disable the hiding of the second magazine mesh, want to see it again. And we'll do the same method of selecting the JMag 2 bone, cursor selected, add a null here, make it JMag 2, parent the second magazine mesh and add a copy transform constraint again. And then once we see the tactical reload, and it's looking good. Both magazines are represented well, they're not positioned differently, they're seated in the magazine. Another method I found to attach this JMag 2 is to make another duplicate of magazine 2 and we'll rename this to magazine ref as in reference, because what I'll do is have a point of reference for where the magazine should be when it's fully seated in the mag well. So let's hide that and do the same thing with JMag 1 by making a null where JMag 2 is and adding a copy constraint to JMag 2, and immediately you can tell the rotation position is screwed up, but it's following the bone regardless. Now go to a frame where the magazine is fully seated in the gun, not animated at all. Let's say here, make the reference magazine visible and then select the mesh, cursor selected, and for magazines to mesh, not the null, select to cursor. And for the rotation, we can just return back to default. We don't have to like fiddle manually, and you can see it's in the same exact position as the reference magazine. We just hide the reference magazine both in the viewport and render, and now it's looking all good. And yes, you can apply this method for bones like J-Bolt to copy over the animations into the bolt of the Battlefield 2042's 2 scar. But you can tell the proportions aren't exactly 1-to-1, and you'll need to manually offset the transformations with keyframes, or you can animate the bolt yourself. And if you want, even animate the bolt cache just to bother all those animators that can't be bothered to do literal minutes worth of work.
It's that easy.
Now time for the real deal. The Nerf Scar from Fortnite. I got this weapon model from this Fallout 4 mod from Nexus mod, and once we position this in place, you can tell the handguard immediately is way bulkier, and really the only point of contact I was focused on was matching up the trigger guard and the magazine to some extent, else it is completely different proportionally wise. And again, same method for the magazines. For JMag 1, go to non-animated idle pose, set the bone in place, copy constraint, all that jazz, and JMag 2 had the same method. And with that, immediately you can tell that this isn't going to cut it. You can see that the magazine is completely off center of where his hand should have the magazine holding in his hand, and just everything isn't looking well. So that's where the power of animation layers come in. So I'm using this add-on by Tal Hershko from the Blender Market that replicates the ability to easily add layers like in Maya without having to fiddle in the NLA editor to make animation layers. First of all, you want to select your Morpher 2 Scar armature rig and then enable animation layers. Obviously tick off remove NLA tracks and then immediately add a new track. We'll call this base adjustments. Check with the NLA editor and peruse the timeline to make sure it hasn't altered the animation sequence in any way, isn't deleted anything. And we're good to go. Now what we'll do with this animation layer is to adjust the left arm to properly hold the gun in its neutral position. So just turn on auto keying on and make sure when you're doing this neutral position there's no animation going on. And we want to make the slightest amount of adjustments to the arm and hand and finger rotations, nothing extreme, since obviously this will carry out additively to the rest of the animation. This is where you can debate with what I'm doing with the whole arm bone, is that sure you can set up an IK rig and sure can make it way easier to adjust the arm, but secretly I've been just shifting the entire arm from the shoulder bone, and instead of making the needs to reach the gun by adjusting the elbow here, vice versa. You know, it's a thing of you won't see the cheeky thing that I'm doing in the view model camera, and it doesn't matter. Obviously this doesn't apply for making view model animations from scratch, but yeah, there's that. And again, I'm just checking through multiple views as okay, and now you can see I go through the timeline to make sure the animation is now adding into the existing animation. But this will most likely never fix up the animation through and through for all points of the animations, from reloading, inspecting, first raise. As you can see, his hand is clipping through the magazine still, and he's not reaching the bolt correctly. Although we'll not need to keyframe the influence on this, since this is now the default untouched pose that we'll be going by now at this point. So let's go through the first example of fixing up a specific animation in the sequence. Starting with a simple one, let's do first raise, add a new layer, and we're going to name that first raise. The specific for first raise I'll explain later. And go to the first part where the hands are not in the correct position. So here is when the hand is making contact with the bolt. Then we just do the little cheating with just shifting the shoulder bone to fix this, and then just find the key points to fix, like where his arm should be when the bolt is fully cocked. You can already start to see this is adding to the animation and shifting his arm again. But since the animation is already done and he's going back to neutral pose, all we have to do, instead of failing to make sure the arm is back into neutral pose, is just to keyframe the influence to 0, double making sure the NEN layer should be like this. Also, I'm animating the influence to go back to 0 when conveniently his arm is off screen and then coming back to reach for the hand guard. Now let's move on to the bolt. In this case, I chose to keyframe it manually instead of copying over the J-bolt animation, since it would be too much of a hassle fixing up the locations for this small video. But I mean, again, you can just do this whole like J-bolt constraint thing. I'm just keyframing alongside the ones I did with the armature rig. I'm also using the graph editor just to make it easier to fiddle with the keyframes. And if in doubt, you need to check from the Marfa 2 scar. You can just disable the hiding it in the viewport, and then you can see where to match up and then use that as a point of reference. And with that, it's done for first raise. Now I'm going to demonstrate an example with magazines involved. I've already done this layers for inspect, and I'll also explain why there's 2 involved later. So let's add a new layer and go to a point where the start of our reload animation is and where we start need to adjusting. Also, I like to hide all the bones under J gun just to make sure that it's not interfering and cluttering up the screen. All we just have to do is just hold shift to hide all the children bones when hiding it from viewport, and not just the J-gun bone individually if you just don't hold shift. So let's start with the magazines. As you can see, it's not sitting well in the mag well at this point in the animation. So I'm adding keyframes to adjust so it can go inside. And it's best to add at each keyframe point of the animation, from the part where it's fiddling with the gun going against the mag well surface and when it actually goes inside. So I'm just animating the magazine mesh itself, and simple as just animating it, making sure the axis is local so it's easier to move into position. And once we're done with that, we just go back to the armature rig and then doing all the bone stuff, adding keyframes, points of the animation, matching up where the arm should be fixed up, and then adding a neutral pose keyframes before adjusting. So I just select all the bones, make a keyframe just to make sure that we aren't deviating too much, because before then I'm just gonna adjust it something crazy. And then I'm also adding this final animation point where the second the magazine that's going back into his pouch is in correctly in position. And again, the whole benefit of this animation layers add-on is that we can just turn down the influence when the animation sequence is done, and we don't have to worry about making sure all these bones go back to default and idle at the end or beginning of an animation. So you can just set these keyframes to influence to go back from 0 to 1 and back to 0. I'm doing this conveniently when his arm is going from reaching with the magazine and then going back to the hand guard. And I'm also just double checking in the NLA editor that the influence is animated with this graph line going from 1 to 0. And there's no need to animate the influence from there, since you can just do it from the animation layers window. And this extends to why there's 2 layers actually for the inspect in this case. Because if I go to the first one, I deviated the shoulder and wrist bones so far down, rather than just adjusting and bringing back everything to neutral, I can just turn down the influence and start a fresh one with another layer. It's just laziness, honestly, because sure, you can just set neutral keyframes at change of the pose, but yeah. Also, I'm just showing that little bolt pullback Now you can in theory have separate animation layers for repeating instances like holding the magazine whilst tactical reloading and stuff, but honestly in my experience the animation layers I do for animation sequence like say tactical reload and empty reload are just so vastly dependent and not cross compatible that I just end up making animation layer adjustments for every animation sequence like I did here. One for inspect, well two really, tactical reload, reload empty, and etc. One more thing before I get down to business before doing all these animation sequences, I just want to show a thing of keyframing the visibility of the bullets, or darts in this case, when doing an empty reload, because obviously we don't want any in the empty magazine, or just doing those mistakes that other games do where an empty magazine doesn't have bullets but it still shows. And after a lot of manual work, we finally got the finished animation sequence. And of course, the missing part here still is, where's the firing animation? So for the firing animation, as I mentioned earlier, my method to closely replicate the recoil pattern happening in-game is to just 3D track it. Now your choice of what to use as a 3D tracker is up to you. Obviously the key goes to make sure it can export a null that can be used in Blender. As such, to skip any third-party schmuckery, you can in fact use Blender's built-in tracker, which I've done a lot for the FPS edits. The reason I switched to KeenTool's GeoTracker is that when it would constantly fail to track the Odin for the Nerf Stampede animation. One, because of how thumpy the recoil is, but else it can deal quite good with less exaggerated recoil, like for example the Knight Ornaments SMG or fin that I use for the negative FPS edit. It did a pretty good track, and then you can just export the track by constraint F curve so you can get a null F curve value. Now let's open After Effects and drop the 60 FPS video. The reason being that I feel like it'll be best to ensure that it'll get the motion quite down instead of using the 30 FPS version. Don't worry, I'll show what to do to apply this for the 30 FPS project. I also went ahead and just did this thing where any part of the video that isn't shooting parts is just a static frame out of SCAR idle, so it doesn't track anything else. It's just to make it easier to plop in the track null into the project instead of segmenting different parts of the video and combining keyframes and all. Now just add in the GeoTracker effect, grab some coffee or vodka if you're feeling hardcore. Alright, it's done analyzing, and now we just change the source to primitive type as plane, and then shift click on the corners to add control points so we can move to scale and skew the plane into plane. Now eventually I add a third point, but for now I'll see how 2 points do so. The reason I chose to always track the back of the arm sights is because it's the easiest and best that shows the recoil of the gun instead of say the front sights or the side of the gun. This also extends to why I always record my reference footage with iron sights or any sight that isn't too far front of the gun or obstructing anything sort of like that. Also, we'll need to go to Windows, Extensions, KeenTools to get our tracking buttons, and then obviously we start tracking from there, from the starting point of firing, and let it run until the plane starts skewing a bit too much. Adjust that, and you can see why I added a third point to ensure it's flat. 4 might be unnecessary and a bit too more cumbersome, and third will control the rotation. And then it's just a matter of ensuring as best we can to make sure this plane is flat on the iron sights and not deviating too far. Sometimes going back, tracking backwards to clean up any sudden skewing, then add a keyframe to the second time of firing and repeat it all. Now for exporting, just export null under object track, and we got a 3D null. Don't worry if the rotation is going crazy, we'll be dealing that in Blender, but I'm just making sure it's ultimately staying on the iron sights, and it's looking pretty good. Now we'll just need to go File, Export, FBX to AE Pro, I'll link this add-on too, and export for 3ds Max. It doesn't matter since I tried both options and imported in Blender and has the same exact F-curve values. Unfortunately, when you try to import the FBX with the default FBX importer, you get this error where it's an ACII type BX. Same thing with the My imported exported version. There's a tool out there to convert it to binary, but if you also have the better FBX importer add-on, that does the job too. So immediately in the F-curve graph, you can tell it goes on twice as long as the animation, and that's since we did our tracking at 60 FPS. But don't worry, we'll shrink that to 30 FPS later. What we want to do now is delete the rotation and scale values, just hide hide the location values and do as such. Next, I'm scaling the keyframes so the idle position is the same. As you can tell, it's different value at different times. So using the cursor line to scale on the y-axis, then removing the keyframes we don't need, so I can then copy and paste the same keyframe every time the recoil is done. Also, for some reason it changed the project to 60 FPS, so set that back to 630 FPS. Next, I was cleaning up any keyframes that deviated a bit too much from the rest, such as this high spike down here. I'd either shift up the keyframes or copy and paste from another section to override it. Now for the moment, to slow it down by 2x, just drop it down in the NLA editor and set the playback speed to 0.5. The reason I'm doing it like this and not scaling it on the x-axis in the F-curve editor is because that's destructive and can jank up the keyframes. Don't worry, whenever we want to edit the keyframes afterwards, it'll actually reflect the new playback speed, so you can adjust in sync with the animation. Now we want to place this on the iron sights of the gun, so just make a null in place, parent the shooting track object to it, and place and rotate. Since the object track was on a slight angle, I made the null angled before parenting it. Now we just select the scar L and view model arms rig and parent it to the object track, making sure we do this when the gun is idle. And we got recoil, but it's not as thumpy as I want, looking like Sledgehammer ass recoil here. So to scale it up, we'll first set the cursor to 0 point, then simply scale the keyframes using the reference footage as a nice indicator for how the back of the gun should go. Again, fixing up more deviating keyframes here. Here's a quick timelapse of me animating the reciprocating bolt. Initially I had the genius idea to time the bolt going back and forth by copying the keyframes from the shooting track null as a reference for the timing when it should do so. But ultimately I scrapped this because the frame difference when it goes back and forth is just 2 frames. So it's not going to matter about precision timing as I initially thought. Since the SCAR-L is around 600 rounds per minute, I'd imagine for around 900 rounds per minute and higher, you shrink this down to a 1 frame difference. Plus motion blur is going to negate this attention to details anyway. But I will be using this technique to apply for another factor. Before we go into that factor, I've attached this simple emitter that will shoot the right amount of Nerf darts. I've just got it parented to the base Fortnite SCAR-L null, nothing like the J gun or parenting to the bone of any sort. And it follows the barrel as simple as that. Here's the settings, got it baked, and done a different one for the full mag dump. Else you can't just yoink the emitter setup from the top blend. Obviously real bullets would be way faster or non-negligible, and you can just rather have an image playing with the animated smokescreen card playing about. Now what we can do to unify a null to control both the view model arms and the gun and the shooting track null and emitter is to make a master control null. Now in this case we already got this done with the shooting track null that has this done. As you can see, when we shift this, the view model and everything follows, and we play, now it's up here. Other than that, the Nerf darts shooting, since we'd have to rebake the emitter. Although you cannot rotate this null since, as you can see, it's rotating the camera too, and it's happening since we're shifting the tag camera bone that's under the view model armature, so keep that limitation in mind. Now the reason I'm bringing this up is because with the X model and XM Black Ops 3 setup I've done before, I've had another null named master null that would subsequently parent the gun view model armature and shooting track null, nothing else. Also, one thing to note for both systems, don't parent the camera unless you plan to have the character traverse, which in this case won't. Back to the factor I was going to go to when utilizing the shooting track keyframes for another aspect, and that being the camera shake. So what we can do is just copy the keyframes. We'll just need the Y location values, that's the juicy ones, and nothing else, and paste into the Y rotation that's responsible for camera roll. Now immediately you can tell without adjustments it's going all over the place, obviously since we're going all the way down to -500 degrees. So we'll need to scale it way down to a couple degrees and shift it up so the midpoint of the rotation is 0, since right now it's sitting as majority negative values. And here's the time-lapse playing around, copying keyframes elsewhere to paste over ones that deviate a bit too much just to unify the shape and not have anything jump out too much. Eventually I got a ground plane scaled up just in line with the wood flooring in game as more reference points to ensure the shaking isn't coming off as some kind of earthquake is happening, or it's just Soul Nerd's perspective of how it feels to shoot an LMG. You'll also notice that the camera simply just goes up and then down when the final bullet exits. So it's just simple as adding keyframes to replicate that the up and down motion. I also used the cube that's conveniently lined up with the brick wall behind as reference. And then to compensate the camera going up, I also shifted and slightly rotated the master null to keep it more in frame. There is one more final step to shake things up. Since the view model is completely still when there's no animation going on, we'll be adding noise modifiers to the Y and Z location of the master null. No need for X, since that's just going to bring the gun back and forth. Now, most of the time I use these values of 25.9 for scale, 0.1 for strength for the Y location modifier, and 4 for scale, and 0.02 for strength for the Z location. Although in this case, I guess to do with the scale of the gun, I wasn't as pleased with this, so I went about testing new values, shifting the offset phase of the Y location to avoid this awkward sway after an animation sequence is finished, and eventually ended up with these values. Just a before and after. Even the subtlest shakeup brings some difference. Now for the scene, just import your map of choice with accompanying lighting and all, and personally, I wouldn't touch the scale or position of the camera and view model setup. Rather, it would just be easier to scale the entire map. Now if you want to render at 60 FPS, just change the frame rate and make sure for time stretching, new to 200, keep the other one at 100, and make sure to double your end frame or else it'll render just half the animation. By the way, I only do this after I completely finish my animation. I want to just adjust everything and make sure that it's at 30 FPS, and if I want to go back, I'd set it back to 30 FPS. If you want, you can even add motion blur. I just stick with 0.5 for the shutter value. And going back to that separate view model from the world thing, if you ever dabbled with the settings menu in a post Modern Warfare 2019 title, it does this thing where it has a separate layer for motion blur between the view model and the world. And if you're a monster, you enable both motion blur for both the view model and world. And obviously it's personal preference, but I enjoy the look of the view model having the motion blur. So to replicate this, you can render the view model only by rendering the world as a holdout and then have transparency enabled, and then you can this way you can have a separate render between the view model, and then you hide the view model unless it's influenced the shadow. Then you have to disable camera and then make sure it's casting a shadow in the world, and then render that world without motion blur separately. But unfortunately, just when I thought this motion blur thing would be smooth sailing by enabling just motion blur for both the world model and view model, I found that this glitch thing is still occurring, as you can see here, well, at least for me in this animation. And if it doesn't happen to you, just skip like 30 seconds ahead. If you already guessed from dissecting the way the magazine swapping occurs from mag 1 to mag 2, this is what's causing that glitching motion blur, since it's going at such a rapid pace and it's supposed to be instantaneous, but the motion blur is catching this instantaneous motion to have motion blur for some reason. What you can do to fix this is either disable motion blur for the magazine mesh down to the keyframes it swaps entirely, but it'll look bad, or you can just render the keyframes where this glitching is occurring without motion blur and opt to use something like Real Smart Motion Blur add-on for After Effects to cover up that aspect that's not having a native Blender Cycles motion blur. Or heck, you can just opt out all this motion blur and just use Real Smart Motion Blur all in post. Now I just stick with the default 0.5 value again for Real Smart Motion Blur, but what I'd like to do on top of that render is only have this enabled for the view model as a mask. So I have this adjustment layer with Real Smart Motion Blur, and then I render the view model as a separate layer as a PNG mask, and then use that as the alpha channel mask to enable that RSMB only affects this point. Now it is causing this slight cutting off thing here where the motion blur isn't like completely going over to the world too, but honestly I cannot see this whilst playing back the video. It's only visible when pausing the video, and for this trade-off you don't have to render the background separately, and it's up to you. For me, I don't mind a little sacrifice for rendering both the view model, world, and all that stuff. And here's some quick looks into the After Effects post-processing and audio compositing. And with all that, the final render. By the way, if you're wondering why this whole tutorial is focused on the magazine-fed assault rifles, well, let's just say magazine-fed guns are the easiest to work. For example, here's my setup with the Smith & Wesson 500 revolver. I should have all the correct parts, and when I import it, let's say the empty reload, you can see the spent casings are ejecting, but the speed reloader doesn't have the bullets right until this frame, where they appear. So it seems they do this switcheroo thing with the static model when transitioning to moving parts, and you basically have to attach the bullets manually to the speed roller and hide them at the frame and all. And this is set up I got for the HK21 as an example for light machine guns, and even then there's still some work to do, correctly depicting the belt having bullets when reloading the new box, and I don't even want to get into firing correct amount of bullets that many older games don't even bother trying to depict. For fun, I'll show what I did with the negative. It's a combination of an animated array to simulate the bullets going in and out of the LMG, a boolean to cut it off, and animating the curve in such a jank manner to simulate grabbing the belt and seating it in. I'd vouch COD definitely has a much more sophisticated system in place, but yeah, there's my jank method. For aim down sight animation, there's a separate seanims for them, and when I import that, say that's the real empty ADS, it didn't shift the camera into position or pull the armature to actually aim down sight, so I guess it's dealt with in engine. But you can see obviously the animation is there to maintain the gun in place as opposed to non-ADS where it's swaying all about. And you can simulate pulling in for aiming down sight like how I did with the Nerf Stampede, using a master null that pulls in like this with a couple of keyframes going on. Also, you can see the camera's focal length pulling in, and this all helps with the having the in-game footage to closely replicate the way he pulls in ADS. And here's a quick test of how it looked with the SCAR-L, just filling it and seeing as a proof of concept. Now, the other thing you might have noticed from time to time is that I would use multiple weapon animation on the same gun, like say the bazooka reload on the Nerf Stampede, whilst the other one obviously came mostly from the G36 animations obviously. And this is possible since the gun's armature bone names are the same. But one thing you'll definitely notice once you say import AN94 animations onto the AK-47 for example, the gun parts are all over the place, and this is because the gun bones locations are obviously unique to that weapon. But you can fix this in a jank manner by using animation layers to fix the positioning of the gun parts and magazine to look normal per se. It's not 100% foolproof and requires a lot of jank keyframes to mitigate the offsetting bones, but it's definitely possible. For example, here's the animation layers I got for the bazooka reload on the Nerf Stampede. So he's reaching the battery compartment correctly instead of a rocket. And again, using animation layers to adapt the AK-74 use animation from Black Ops Cold War onto the AS Val from Modern Warfare 2019. Well, that's really it. Honestly, some techniques shown here have been unchanged for a year or two, and I've been planning to make a tutorial earlier, but others like geo-tracking and using C models are recent techniques. So ultimately, I think this is the best time to make this tutorial that encompasses all the techniques and stuff I learned from doing these edits over the years. And I like to give a big, huge shout out to the Scopulas Discord server with figuring out these C model and seanim stuff and making tools for this to happen. Hope this helps with any aspect to importing, exporting COD animations, whatever you're going to plan to do with this. And hope Treyarch makes something worthy for these edits too, since you can tell these are just a result of being a fanatic of Infinity Ward's top tier animations. And with that, see ya!